Well, g'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I want to share with you some extremely important things I've discovered about the Canon R5 Mark II after using it extensively in the field. I've taken 20,000 photos now and I have a much better idea of how it performs. And I've got some good things and I've actually got some things that are quite disappointing. I think you'll find this extremely useful if you're thinking about upgrading to this camera. All right, the easiest way to do that is just to compare the R5 II to the R5 in regards to the specs or features that are important to me as a wildlife photographer. The first one is the buffer. Now on the Canon R5, it's not bad, it's pretty good, but we were restricted to 20 frames per second. You couldn't shoot any slower than that, and that was annoying, especially if we hit the buffer, we have to wait and then hit it and go on and off. So my hope was that the R5 II would have an improved buffer experience. I hoped it would be bigger. I hoped that the internal memory would be higher. Has it improved? Well, it's definitely got different frame rates. So we can now choose from a variety of frame rates, I think going from 7.5 seconds all the way to 30 seconds. And that's fantastic. So we, the user, can choose which is the right buffer size for us. Now, if you saw my previous video, I raved about how much improved the buffer was on this camera. I just haven't been hitting the buffer at all in the field. And I just assumed that I was shooting in 20 frames per second. But I've actually discovered the entire time I've been shooting in 15 frames per second. So that's my bad for giving you the wrong information. The camera defaults to 30 frames per second and then 15 frames per second. You've got to go into the menu and physically change it to 20. So that had me thinking, well, is it actually any better at 20? Because I haven't shot at 20, I've been shooting at 15 and it's been fantastic. So what I did was I got both cameras, the R5 and the R5 II, and I did a very backyard buffer test. I just held down the shutter until I hit the buffer and then I looked at how many photos I got. So I started with the R5 Mark II. I was shooting at very high ISO, so 12,800, which gives us the biggest file types. I just held down the shutter. So I took 136 photos. You of course would get a lot more photos if you're shooting at a lower ISO, but I was just testing it at that high ISO because this is the worst case scenario. So 136 shots. I've then put this lens on the R5. I've done the exact same test. I've just held down the shutter until I hit the buffer. And then I had a look at how many photos, 136. I'm a bit confused if I'm being honest. I ran it again, 136. So in my backyard test, the actual internal buffer of the R5 and the R5 II is identical. It's about 4.5 gigabytes worth of internal memory. And that had me confused because I thought the R5 II was supposed to be bigger, but I can't see that in my initial test. They appear to be exactly the same, which is unusual. So I did one final test is I just held down the shutter for 60 seconds. So it would obviously get to the buffer, clear, shoot, and I wanted to see how many shots we could get in this amount of time. So with the R5 Mark II, I've just held down the shutter and as we can see, it's going, it hits the buffer, it then clears and then starts shooting. And after 60 seconds, we had 684. I then put on the R5, switched over. We did the exact same thing with the R5, held it down for 60 seconds. And then at the end of the 60 seconds, it had a 604. So this is where our improvement is. So the buffer size hasn't changed, but clearly something of how the camera reads and writes has changed. The R5 II is approximately about 12% faster at clearing that buffer in between shots. So in the real world, when we're out shooting, the R5 II does have an advantage in terms of the buffer, which is good. For me personally, I'm probably going to shoot in 15 frames per second now, because if I shoot in 15 frames per second, it takes 13 seconds to hit the buffer. You're pretty much never going to hit the buffer. So if you just want a shooting experience where you don't have to worry, I'd just suggest shooting in 15 frames per second. If you want a higher frame rate like 20 or 30, you can clearly just change it if you need it. Now the other thing I really like is we now have an audible shutter, which is fantastic. I really missed that on the original R5. So to have an audible shutter, for me, it just gives me that feedback. I love having that. So that's definitely a massive improvement. Now the next feature, and it's a really good feature, is the Canon R5 II features that stack sensor. So it's much, much faster than the old R5. On the old R5, occasionally you got wobbles between shots and you could get some rolling shutter if you had fast moving wings. I must admit, I didn't notice it all that often with the R5 and it didn't stop me shooting in electronic mode. But of course, if we can reduce rolling shutter, then that's a really good thing. And the R5 II 100% does that. It pretty much eliminates most rolling shutter and we don't really get the wobbles anymore. I had no issue whatsoever. Now I didn't shoot a lot of fast action, but I did get a galah flying towards me and its wings came out and we nailed this shot. Very, very happy with it. Definitely no rolling shutter in that. So If rolling shutter is an issue for you, maybe you shoot sports or ball sports, then the R5II is going to be a significant improvement. Now let's talk about one of the biggest features the R5II has, and that is a working pre-capture. I can't stress how important pre-capture it is and how it will revolutionarily change how you shoot wildlife. So on the R5, it does not have pre-capture. What is it? All it means is that on the R5II, when we half depress the shutter, it starts storing up to 0.5 seconds worth of images in the buffer. So if we're shooting at 20 frames per second, we're storing 10 frames in the buffer. So when we depress the shutter, it just automatically writes those previous 10 shots to your memory card and then continues shooting from there. And those are full raw shots. There's no silly file. It just works, and it works perfectly. Why is this so good? It's because it enables you to capture those images that you might have missed before without it. For example, if you've got a bird leaving a perch, if you've got a bird giving you a head turn, if you've got a pose that you're missing. Think about ducks that come up out of the water and flap their wings, or they dive. How many times you've missed it and all you get is the feet, or you just missed that wing position and you think, oh, if only I'd been half a second quicker. Now pre-capture helps us because it will capture those images, and it's just incredible. And it also gives you some flexibility and creativity to capture shots you wouldn't have even been able to before. So you wait for certain shots with birds on perches and things, anticipating this sort of movement. Now I had that exact scenario. I went to a local lake. I had a welcome swallow on a rock, and it would fly off and then come back to this rock. So I knew that I was able to get some sort of flight shot of this bird leaving the perch. There's no way I'd be quick enough to time it on its own with the naked eye. So I've simply just focused on the swallow, I've half depressed the shutter, engaged pre-capture, waited, and when the bird took off, I just depressed the shutter, took some photos, and off flew the bird. And that enabled us to get a shot like this. So we've got this very interesting pose as the bird's about to leave the rock, and then it flies off and we get this next shot. So I don't think I would have ever got these two shots if I had not had pre-capture. And that's just really, really cool. And I also went out and I was photographing some galahs. They were on this perch. There's a whole group of them. I knew at some point one of these birds would fly off the perch. So again, I've just auto-focused on the birds, half depressed the shutter, pre-capture, and then that galah has jumped off the perch. I've just depressed the shutter, and we've managed to get a sequence of shots as the bird's flying away from that perch, resulting in this photo. And I honestly just can't get enough of this feature, and I'll share one more example. I had a sulfur-crested cockatoo. It was backlit, and sometimes they raise their head and their crest comes out. They don't do it all the time, so you have to capture the moment that the cockatoo pulls its crest out. It's generally when another bird's flying past or something's happening. So again, focusing on the bird, I see the head movement, hold down the shutter, we get a range of shots, and it enables us to get this one, a backlit shot of an iconic cockatoo with its crest. Happy days. So again, you can tell that I just love pre-capture. So the downside to it is clearly you just can take way more photos. All right, that leads us on to the autofocus, which is arguably one of the most important things in a wildlife camera. It just enables us to track the subject and get in-focused photos. So it's very important. And anyone who's used the R5 will know how much of a leap it was from the old DSLRs. To have eye tracking is just groundbreaking. The ability just to track a subject, bird in flight and different things, just awesome. And the R5 has been very, very good. So when I read about the R5II having a faster sensor, faster autofocus, I was hoping that there'd be a marked improvement in the AF performance of the R5II. There's no doubt that it's much faster to acquire the subject. It's almost instant. Like when you focus on something and you hit the focus button, it is lightning fast at going to that subject, and it's very good at identifying the initial acquisition. So even a small bird in the frame, it's very good at finding it and going onto it. So you can see in this viewfinder footage, there's a lot of trees here. The subject is tiny and it's backlit, but the camera found it. And that's kind of amazing that the camera could find such a small bird in this scene and just stick to it. So I've got no complaints. And in low light, it's far more superior to the R5. In low light, it just finds the subject much, much better, which is really, really good. So what are the downsides to the autofocus? In initial testing, for some reason, occasionally it just gets overexcited, and you might be on a subject and then it seems to see, like if you've got multiple birds, sometimes it gets confused or excited and wants to go to a different bird, or it sees something with better contrast and it wants to go to it. It's almost too active. It's almost trying to please you too much. And so instead of locking on to one subject, it seems to want to go to another subject. And my good mate Jan has had a lot more experience with the camera than me. And he's been photographing finches and different things in the Northern Territory. And he found that very frustrating that the camera just wouldn't stay locked on to the subject he wanted. It would often move around. And in the menu, we can change it to locked on. And he's tried a lot of different things, but he said the R5 seemed to lock onto the subject a bit better. Maybe that can be changed in the firmware with the software. Did I find that? Occasionally I did. When I first used it, I found it did want to sometimes go to the wrong subject. In my last shoot, I actually went to autofocus auto and then all the way locked on to just try and calm the camera down to stick to the subject. Because with wildlife, if we focus on a bird and we engage autofocus, that's the subject we want. We don't want the camera to then go jumping somewhere else. And it's actually very annoying that we don't even have a feature to tell the camera that we don't want it to move. Well, what we should be able to do is focus on a bird. We're focused on the bird. We should then be able to push another button to say, never leave this subject. This is the one I want. Do not leave this under any circumstances. And we don't seem to have that at the moment. If the camera thinks another subject is better, it will often go to that and then we have to drive it back. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's just frustrating when it does. And we should be able to override the camera. Something else very disappointing with the autofocus, and that's in regards to pre-capture. So I showed you those shots of those swallows that I took before leaving the rock. For some reason, the camera can't seem to track that subject once it leaves the rock. So I'm focusing on the swallow. I've got AF engaged. The swallow leaves the rock and I track the swallow. The autofocus can't seem to track that subject. It just can't get it. It either hits the feet or it hits the rock. And you can see in this sequence, the bird leaves the rock, it's sharp, and then it goes soft. It just can't seem to track that subject. And I did this multiple times and it lost the subject every time. And it's happened to me numerous times now. And I spoke to Jan and he's had the same experience. The camera just struggles to follow the subject once it leaves the perch. It's not too bad if it's horizontal because you're in the same focal plane. But if that bird's moving towards you or moving away from you, the AF seems to struggle. Do I have an explanation for that? It's possible that because we've got it dialed down to locked on, when that subject quickly moves, the camera's just too slow to realize that the subject has moved and then to start tracking it. I suspect that's what it is. I need to do more testing, but we need to figure out a way for the camera to be able to actually track properly once that subject leaves the perch. So at the moment, it's just not working properly. And so if you've experienced this, let us know in the comments. Hopefully I'm not the only one, but for whatever reason at the moment, I'm struggling with that focus, especially with using pre-capture when it's flying towards you. All right, the next improvement I really wanted to see was the overheating. The R5 can overheat, especially in video. And if you're in really warm climates or humid climates, it could even overheat in stills. R5 II, it's not an issue. This camera is way better. It just doesn't seem to overheat. So I've definitely had the warning come up because pre-capture does tend to warm your camera up. If you're holding down the autofocus or the half depressing the shutter non-stop, it will warm up. Again, Jan, my friends in the Northern Territory, very humid tropical climate, he hasn't had the camera overheat. He's definitely had the warning bars, but he hasn't had the camera overheat. The only thing Canon got wrong there was they've put the overheating warning right over the histogram when you're looking through it on an LCD or a monitor. So you can't see the histogram when the warning comes up. So they need to either move one of those two so we can see them both at the same time. Alrighty, that leads me to the elephant in the room and my biggest disappointment, the R5 Mark II. And I honestly didn't think this would be an issue. And I didn't really give it any thought prior to buying this camera or even thinking about it. And what is it? It's its high ISO performance. It's its low light performance, the dynamic range and the image quality when we shoot at ISO 6400 or 12,800. Why wasn't I concerned? Mainly because the R5 was so good. The R5 is one of the best cameras on the market for low light performance. It's staggering how good this is. I could shoot this up to 12,800 ISO without too many issues, use some noise reduction software, happy days, pull up the shadows. It was just so good, and it was a big improvement over the 5D4 and my previous cameras. So I just expected that the R5 II would be the same as the R5. But you know what they say about assuming, you definitely shouldn't do it. And unfortunately, the very first time I started looking at the files of the R5 II, I thought, this looks different to the R5. I'm seeing more noise, I'm seeing more color noise. I'm just not seeing quite as much detail in the high ISO shots. And so that left me a little bit confused as to why that was. So what I've ended up doing was doing some comparison shots between the R5II and the R5, and I can see a difference. And I'll show you now on the screen a shot at ISO 12800, which is quite high. Can you tell the difference here? Does one seem to have less noise and more detail than the other? It's a little bit hard on YouTube, but for me, it's obvious when I'm looking at the two images. And the R5 is just a much cleaner file. There's more noise in the R5II shot, without a doubt. And you can see this a bit more when you underexpose and then lift the shadows. So I've done that. I've purposely underexposed. I've then lifted up the shadows. I've actually turned up the green slider, which shows us when there's no detail in the blacks. And when we compare them, you can see again that the R5 just has less noise. So how do we confirm this? Well, luckily there's a person much smarter than me that does a lot of testing, proper testing online, and then uploads those results. That resource is called Photons to Photons. So it's a little bit confusing, but how they test it is when they have 6.5 stops dynamic range, what is the highest ISO that we get to get that dynamic range? Because remember, as our ISO goes up, we get less dynamic range. So what we want to have is we want to have a lot of dynamic range at high ISO. And this test does that. So the R5 at 6.5 stops of dynamic range has an ISO of 5,435, which is actually very good. Now, what was the R5 Mark II? The R5 Mark II is 4,846. It doesn't sound like that much of a difference, but it is. And for unknown reasons, I'm not sure, somebody can let me know in the comments, when you shoot in electronic shutter mode, you seem to get less dynamic range. So the R5 in electronic shutter was 5,117. The R5 Mark II in electronic shutter was 4,392. That number is getting pretty low. So how does it compare to other cameras? Let's have a look at 40 megapixel plus first. And on the screen, you can see that the R5 is the clear winner, and then followed by a couple of Sony cameras, and then we've got our Canon cameras. Surprisingly, that old DSLR 5DS actually has better dynamic range than the R5 Mark II. And then for some reason, I'm not sure why, Nikon cameras don't have as good a dynamic range, but according to this test, they're down there at the bottom. That's interesting. What's even more interesting is if we compare it to all cameras. It seems the new Nikon cameras are struggling, but that old D5 is an absolute monster when it comes to dynamic range with the very highest score. Then we have the R3, then the A9, the old A9, and so on. But the R5 actually performs very, very well in this test. But look where the R5 II is. It's well down the list, and electronic shutter especially. It's towards the bottom. And that is a major concern. This might be the first time I have ever bought a camera and had worse quality, like at high ISO. And that's a very hard psychological thing for us to deal with or grasp with. When you've been so used to the R5, you're used to this really good standard, this amazing performance, and then you upgrade and you actually get worse than what you had before. Our brains don't like that, and I don't like that. Why should I be paying $5,500 for a camera that has worse performance than the previous generation? And I wasn't aware of that. Maybe I was naive. I had some inkling, I guess, because it seems that the faster the sensor, so if we get these stacked sensors, it seems to reduce dynamic range. So what does this actually mean in the field? Does it make a difference? Is the less dynamic range going to impact us heavily? Yes, it is. It's going to mean you can't shoot at high ISO that you can with the R5. So on the R5, as I mentioned, I'm quite happy to go to 12,800. In reality now, I'm probably going to be shooting at ISO 6400 on this and just trying to expose to the right to make it bright to get the details. It means I'm going to have to use a slower shutter speed. And it just means in those really low light environments, it's not going to be as good as the R5. Is it a deal breaker? Well, no, because all the other features of the camera make it a much better camera to use in the field. I much prefer using the R5 Mark II. It just doesn't quite have the image quality of this one at high ISO. As you can see, I'm a little bit disappointed. I'm sure I'll get over it. It's just I wasn't expecting it. So it's come as a bit of a shock that this new camera is worse than the old one in that regard. Everything else, it seems to be much better, but it would have been nice for this camera to have as good a dynamic range as this one. All right, I've been pretty negative, but I want to be crystal clear. It still has great image quality, and I have taken some really good photos, and I want to share with you an experience I had just the other day. I went to my favorite wetland at Winton with this exact combo, R5II 200-800, and I just had a great time. I got there before the sun was coming up, and there's birds flying around, listening to the birds. It was just awesome. A happy place. But, you know, I'm going to use this camera to its full advantage, and where there was some soft-crested cockatoos flying around and the sun was just starting to come up, and I'm focusing on the cockatoo and I'm hoping for some sort of behavior, and it starts preening, and we nailed this shot. We got the shot of the soft-crested cockatoo preening its back tail. But then I got a shot that I'm very happy with, and it made me smile, and it's the sort of why I get up in the morning. There were birds flying to this tree, and we had this interesting background. So I was thinking I'd love to capture a bird flying through the sky with this background and the sun coming up. So that's exactly what I did. I've got the scene and I'm waiting for these cockatoos, and we ended up getting this shot here. So we've got a cockatoo mid-flight, the sun, the trees, all together makes a very interesting shot that I couldn't be happier with. Let me know if you like this shot. But what I need to be clear about and honest about is this is actually a stitched image. This is 2 exposures to create this one shot. So what actually happened is the bird's flying up to the tree. I'm focused on the bird, and the very first shot I took, it actually focused on the background and not the bird. So the bird was slightly out of focus. The autofocus is then latched onto the bird, but by the time it focused on the bird, it was higher in the frame. So what I've done is I've taken the in-focus bird and I've actually overlaid it on the out-of-focus bird to create this image. And you could call it digital art, but this is what I saw, and this is the image that I've created, and I'm very happy with it. The sun came up, I started walking towards some cockatoos when I heard the beautiful fairy wren, and I spotted the male jumping around in these reeds. So I've quickly got the camera, and he's hopped up and he starts singing, and I've held down the autofocus straight to the bird, and of course I've got this zoom lens, so instead of being nice and tight on the bird, I've zoomed out to whatever I did, 200, 300, to get this much wider habitat, and I took this shot, and I just really like these wider habitat shots, so I was stoked to get this. Now I will admit he was looking a little bit scruffy, he wasn't in his full breeding plumage, so I have actually touched him up a little bit in Photoshop just to give him a little bit more color, but this is the final image, and I'm again very happy with that. So one great thing is we're coming into spring down here, and that means all the birds are getting very active, and the cockatoos are starting to inspect hollows and form pair bonds, and I spotted 2 cockatoos on a branch preening each other, and it was just a lovely intimate moment. And I've captured this shot, and I like this because there's something going on. What I think would be fun is if in the comments you can put a caption to this. There's got to be a funny caption that goes to this photo. I just like how this, it looks like it's talking in the air or giving it a kiss. They're just a lovely moment, and I'd love to hear what you think about it. Now there are a lot of cockatoos here, and we also had some galahs, and it just so happened the galahs landed on this branch that were framed by 2 other branches, and we had sulfur-crested cockatoo, galah, sulfur-crested cockatoo, zoomed out, framed it, and got this photo. And it's just interesting, I guess, to see all these different birds that we're so lucky to get in Australia. But overall, the image quality was fantastic. I had no issue with the image quality. Because I wasn't shooting at high ISO, we have no issue in regards to the dynamic range. So again, it was a great experience. The camera performed very well. I loved the pre-capture, and I'm very happy with the camera. So before I end the video, there's only a couple more things I need to talk about. The first one I mentioned in my last video, it happened on the R5 and it's happening on the R5II, is our very first version seems to crash a bit. It seems to brick or just not work. So sometimes for unknown reason, the camera becomes unresponsive and you've got to remove the battery, put it back in and start again. A number of you in the last video in the comments said this is happening to you. It's happened to me. It's happened to my mate Jan. This should not happen. Like, Canon shouldn't be releasing cameras that are crashing like this. They should do proper testing before they give them to us to prevent us having to do the testing, but that's just the way it is. Hopefully in a firmware upgrade, it will stop crashing. The other slightly annoying thing is these cameras, as I've mentioned, are using brand new batteries, and you need this battery to get pre-capture and video and different things. I ordered 2 extra batteries when I pre-ordered this camera, but when I got the camera, Canon said they don't have enough of these batteries. They're all on back order, and I still don't have them. So I only have 1 battery, and trying to shoot with 1 battery is a bit of a nightmare, and I'm sure many of you are experiencing this. Canon, you should have just made more batteries before you release the camera. And that's just one minor thing, but again, they should have had that sorted out. All right, so that sort of brings me to the end of the video, and I know I've been quite negative in this video, and it's more just out of disappointment and frustration. I am overly happy with the camera. It's just I didn't expect those issues. I didn't expect the dynamic range to be worse, so it's just left that sour taste in my mouth. I'm sure I'll get over that as we go on, and I'm sure it's probably annoying to you as well if you've spent all that money on this camera expecting exactly what I expected. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Are you experiencing the same thing that I'm experiencing? So I still think this is the best Canon camera for wildlife. It's just going to make that decision to upgrade a little bit more tricky for you if you've already got the R5 or you're considering these two cameras. Just as I've mentioned, value proposition, the original R5 is very, very good. The image quality is just absolutely outstanding on that camera. But if you really want pre-capture, you want the variability in the buffer size, the EVF is much better. There's a number of things that are improved. Video, I haven't even talked about that. The video is much better. So there's loads of improvements. You just need to determine now what's important for you and which camera is right for you. So I plan on using this camera a lot more, and hopefully I'll create a lot more videos. If you obviously found this content useful or interesting, give it that thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more of these. I just want to thank all my beautiful members that allowed me to make these videos. If you're not aware, for the cost of less than a cup of coffee per month, you can directly support the channel. You get a cool little bird next to your name, and it just helps me to continue doing what I love. So until the next video, happy birding, take care, see you later.